In the name of Jesus Christ, dear friends, if we were to give a show of hands, it would reveal that a sizable segment of our congregation works in the financial sector. And if you're one of those people, I'm sure that Jesus' parable especially caused your ears to perk up. This parable where a manager was dishonest and instead of being punished, was commended, praised. I suppose, though, if you're in the business world at all, that you could look at this parable and draw from it some simple 101 kind of lessons, right? You read through Jesus' parable and you say, I'll tell you, one thing you should never ever do is tell somebody that you're going to fire them. You fire them and you walk them out the door before they can do any harm to the company. Or you might say, this is why you have to have checks and balances and do audits and have systems built in to protect yourself so that you don't incur these kinds of negligent losses. What in the world was the master thinking when he made the manager the sole authority over the checkbook? This is not good. There's just one thing, though. Those are not the lessons that Jesus draws from this parable. This isn't business 101. It's kingdom economics. And that's what causes all of us to sit here and scratch our heads a little bit and wonder, what in the world is going on? What is the point Jesus is trying to make when a man can waste someone else's money to help others and get commended for it? This parable is maybe even more than troubling or puzzling. It could be that it's offensive. And I don't think it's offensive because that manager was dishonest. We know, of course, that dishonesty is plenty common. And in this case, before we even saw his dishonesty in action, we had inklings that this was the kind of man that he was. The master had heard the charges about him, that he hadn't been a faithful, careful steward. He was no Joseph in Potiphar's house, that's for sure. And so when his dishonesty sprang into action, when we saw him slashing the bills of his master's debtors, we weren't surprised or offended by his dishonesty per se, although we were upset by this man's rather cavalier attitude towards that which wasn't his. The way that he goes about it, bringing them in, telling them to slash their bills and to do it quickly. It suggests, doesn't it, that he had some sort of swagger in his step, saying, whose money is it anyway? There's no skin off my back if my master doesn't get all of the money he's rightly due. So what does it matter if I fudge the books a little bit here and there? That bothers us, doesn't it? That he would waste money that wasn't his. And what bothers us even more, what's perhaps the most offensive thing about this parable, is that the master doesn't get all steamed when he finds out what went down. I can think of a couple ways to take the offense out of this parable, and that's just one of them right there, isn't it? If the master had gotten really angry, and if he had taken that manager to court and punished him to the full extent of the law, we all would have been slapping him on the back and saying, way to go, bro, you got it. People who are dishonest should get punished, right? I suppose another way to take the offense out of this parable would have been if it had been the master himself who had talked about forgiving the debts and instructed the manager to do that. Then we would label this a parable about God's divine grace and forgiveness, and we could walk away from it happy to have this picture of how God treats us. But this is not a parable about forgiveness, is it? And the manager didn't get upset. The master didn't get upset and punish the manager, did he? In fact, he commended him for his shrewdness. And if that troubles you, if you're a little puzzled, I can't help but think that's just where Jesus wants you. I can't help but think that he told a provocative parable where it seems like everybody wins, right? The people whose bills were slashed are certainly happy about it. The manager has friends he can rely on when he gets canned, although they're friends who will know to keep an eye on him so long as he's in their house. And the master doesn't seem to get all bent out of shape, does he? And if you're sitting there puzzled, know this. That's right where Jesus wants you, so that you are all ears when he explains the lesson you are to learn from this parable. For this parable, as puzzling and perplexing and as perhaps offensive as it might be to us, is not a parable that Jesus did not give us the meaning to. He explained it. He laid it all out for us. And if we would but hone in on what Jesus has to say, he would direct us to what we are to learn from this parable of his. It's the very last words of our gospel, the last verse, the last thing that Jesus says, where he unfolds the meaning of this parable. This is what Jesus says. He says, I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. And I want to take those words of Jesus and highlight three big important points that Jesus makes, which taken together unfold the meaning of this parable, this somewhat perplexing parable. The first thing to notice is what Jesus labels wealth. He calls it unrighteous. In fact, he uses the same exact word that he uses to describe the manager, which calls dishonest or unrighteous. And please understand what Jesus is saying here. We know, of course, that Jesus is not telling us in this parable that we should be dishonest in our dealings. That would go against everything else that Jesus ever said. And he is certainly no Robin Hood, who in this case is suggesting that we would rob from the rich to give to the poor. That's not what Jesus means when he calls wealth unrighteous. It's not that you should use ill-gotten gains for the sake of Christ's kingdom. In the same way that Jesus points out that this dishonest manager was acting according to the standards of his age and therefore was a son of his own generation, unrighteous or dishonest, so Jesus also labels wealth here as something which belongs only to this age, to this generation, and in that sense is unrighteous. It doesn't have a place in God's kingdom at all. Which leads Jesus into the second big point he makes. This unrighteous wealth, which is not part of God's kingdom at all, is therefore only temporary and fleeting. You notice that Jesus doesn't doubt whether or not money might fail. He simply assumes that it's going to. He says, use unrighteous wealth for yourself so that when it fails. And you see, now Jesus is getting somewhere, isn't he? He's pointing out to us, is he not, that the money that we have, which doesn't last, well, why would we put our trust in it? Why would we act like a son of our own generation, to use Jesus' own language? I suppose that's maybe startling because it seems that in the church we're in the habit of talking about money as something that's neutral, right? We say it's not money per se that's the problem, it's the condition of the heart. And that is true enough. But I wonder if maybe when we try to baptize money and bring it into the fold, we do as good of a job of separating it from all of the baggage that comes with it as we ought to. I wonder if, despite Jesus' clear words, we don't still think about money in the most positive of terms. When's the last time in a conversation with somebody else you've called it unrighteous wealth, right? I suspect that you are not as certain as Jesus is that this unrighteous wealth is going to let you down and fail. And I even suspect that deep down inside your heart, it is a real struggle not to believe the gods of this age when they tell you that money equals security. And if that is the case, if God has given this money to us so that we don't put our hopes in it, if it's something that's only temporary and passing away, what are we to make of it? That's the third and really the most important thing that Jesus says, the point of his whole parable. What good is this unrighteous wealth? Jesus says it does great good when you use it as he himself has commanded. And what is that use? But to make friends for yourselves. What is Jesus saying there but this? I have given you this unrighteous wealth, not so that you can spend it for yourself, not so that you can pin your hopes on it, but so that you can put it to use serving others. I have entrusted it to you because my view of financial success is not the same as this world's view of financial success. Is it always better to have more, and more for yourself? And are you justified in fighting tooth and claw to hold on to what is yours? Isn't that really the reason why we're offended by the master's actions in this parable? Isn't it because he's going against this world's definition of financial success? He doesn't seem to mind that his resources were wasted. And isn't this the interesting part? The dishonest manager didn't slash his own bill. He slashed others. And you know what that means? It means that this parable is meant to do more than offend us. It's meant to convict us. As Jesus holds out before our eyes a very, very different economic system, one that belongs not to this world at all, but to the sons of light, does he not convict you for how often you have acted like a son of your own generation, a daughter of this age? I suppose I can speak only for myself, but it seems to me that finances are one of the areas in our lives where it's very hard for us to hold on to the reins and follow Jesus. How little we want to spend money on other people, even on our own family members, and yet how happy we are to spend it on ourselves. How willing we are to fight for a few dollars, even at the cost of a friendship. How unwilling we are to be generous, even to those who are closest to us. How frequently we build our security on a pile of gold and silver that we're spending all of our effort piling up and amassing, precipitously balancing on it when Jesus himself is convinced that it's going to fall out from right beneath our feet. How dishonest, in a different sense, have we been with what our Master has entrusted to us? There was another manager, a treasurer, who was crooked in his dealings with money. And you can learn a lesson from him too. According to the gods of this age, according to our world's definition of financial success, it was a win, a shrewd move for Judas when he walked away with the weight of 30 silver coins in his hand. Judging by this world's standards, we would say his bottom line was improved that day. Or was it? How fascinating that God, in his wonder, took that dishonest act of unrighteous wealth used to purchase the life of his Son and turned it into the free gift of eternal, everlasting life that will never fail. How incredible is it that God would repay your selfishness and greed in this way by forgiving it? And not taking your debt and canceling only part of it, 100 to 50 or 100 to 80, but taking the whole bill, crumpling it up, and throwing it away, throwing it on to his Son, who was bought with unrighteous wealth, to buy your soul with his precious blood. And you think about what God has done there at Jesus' cross, and does it not make you open up your ears to also listen to him as he instructs you now on what you are to do with the wealth that he has given to you for this age, for this time? For Jesus says the greatest financial success that you could ever have would be if through the money he has entrusted to you, one more person would be gained for his kingdom. One more friend made, and not a friend who's your friend so that they can use your cottage up north, but a friend in Christ, one who shares with you one faith, one hope, one baptism, one who one day will be there to welcome you into the eternal dwellings. What greater success could there be than that? Is it really always best to have more? Or is it better to learn the lesson of this parable and instead of looking to get more for ourselves, look instead to give more for the sake of others and for the sake of the gospel? You know, every single time you do that, it's a tiny little act of rebellion, a little revolution, taking a stand, raising your fist against the sons of this generation. And don't expect them to praise you for it. They will no doubt assume that you are being defrauded, that it is an absolute waste of money, should you choose to give your money for the sake of the gospel. But at that moment, your true master will be there to commend you for your shrewdness in seeing through the dishonesty of wealth, in realizing that it's going to fail, and in understanding that as you use it, you do so asking yourself, whose money is it anyway?